Behind us, the battle raged on. The worst area was on the summit of the hill, where, according to a messenger, the now encircled American battalion was being pressed back into an ever smaller perimeter. It was obvious they were desperate to find an exit, supported by their howitzers somewhere outside, which did not stop firing round after round on our positions in a fierce attempt to crush the besiegers. Listening to the continuous bursting of shells up there, I thought of Heinrich being in the midst of it. We dared not imagine the casualties among our comrades. We never had experienced such massive shelling in the north. Sometime later on, the inferno burned out and silence descended on this tormented piece of earth. It seemed, and we direly hoped, that we had held the ground around the hills. With the tension easing off, we began to feel our exhaustion. The total lack of food, of sleep, and of protection from the cold for the last 30 hours was written all over our faces. What brought back some life into our worn-out limbs during those lulls, aside from the hope that this matter would soon be over, were the cigarettes which lasted far longer than our food. Nonetheless, there were still duties. We had to keep an eye on the trapped squad down by the bridge, and whether we liked it or not, we had to improve, deepen, and camouflage our foxholes and fortify our gun emplacement with rocks and timber. Somehow, though, we managed brief moments of relaxation, ordinarily remaining upright in our foxholes and dropping off into a 10-second sleep. In the afternoon, the Americans made another attempt to get through to the hilltop. It was only a matter of half an hour, but the attack told us something about our new opponents. This time we saw them dashing up the road with 2 tanks, their roaring engines announcing their approach long before they appeared round the bend. The gunner of the lead tank continuously banged away with his machine gun. We had expected something like that. If they could pass the bridge unharmed, we, up on the bare slope, only had a slim chance in a duel with them. Our bullets would only scratch their armour, while in turn, they would have us at point-blank range as soon as we started firing. The trail, however, was steep, especially downward towards the bridge, and the ground was frozen. So as they rumbled up to the bridge, the first tank spun on the ground, slid sideways and offered her right flank to our men in ambush by the bridge. The next moment, the tank was hit. Smoke poured out. The turret opened and the crew climbed out, obviously wounded, and sought cover behind the second tank. The second tank was blocked by the lead tank, and so, in turn, were our men with their Panzerfaust. There was a brief moment of hesitation on both sides. Then, suddenly, the turret of the second tank opened, and out jumped a single man. Watching through my binoculars, I thought him to be an officer. Ignoring the danger he was exposing himself to, he hurried over to the hollow where the infantry squad was trapped, helped some wounded men to reach the tank, and loaded them on the deck, one after the other. Stunned, we followed this extraordinary rescue action without firing a single shot. The officer jumped back into the tank, spun around on his tracks, and dashed back to the rear. Those of us witnessing the scene, whether near or more distant, instinctively felt there was no honour to be won by firing upon this death-defying act of comradeship. At nightfall, we still were without provisions. Hunger isn't good for morale. There was a growing grumbling among my men. Stricker pointed his chin to the trail below. "What's on your mind?" I asked, being sure I was reading his thoughts. "I think I'll have a closer look at that tank down there," he said. "All right, go ahead. I'll give you half an hour. Make sure you don't get shot at by our own people." Cautiously, he made his way down the hill toward the tank that had come down the day before. He was back in time and brought a few sea rations, cookies, and cigarettes, the first provisions we appropriated from the enemy. My memory of the next 2 days is blurred, probably the result of the continuing frost, hunger, lack of sleep, and the nagging doubt all of us had about coming out of there alive. Nature, or rather the weather conditions, as well as our physical and mental state, became our primary enemy during the rest of our time on the slope. The weather worsened and the battle raged on. The Americans didn't attempt another breakthrough at our ravine, but again and again there were nerve-wracking exchanges of small arms fire in our neighbourhood, indicating assaults from inside and outside the perimeter. Meanwhile, the American artillery continued firing on our positions around the hill, as in turn, our howitzers kept shelling the summit. Snow had started to fall again, and when the wind sprang up, it turned into a blizzard that swept in gusts over the snowbound hills. I see myself standing in the foxhole next to our emplacement. In the bottom, frozen water around my feet as I wake up with a start from a short spell of abysmal sleep, and I see Bing's and Stricker's profiles next to me, hard and grim under the rim of their helmets, their hoods on top and their anoraks covered with snow. I'll never forget my own secret thoughts during the night. They were about dying and surviving, promises that if I ever got out of there I would never in my life complain about anything on earth, as long as there was shelter and warmth and a regular meal. I thought of becoming a farmer, which seemed to guarantee such vital needs, something which never before had entered my mind. The American battalion gave up on the 5th day after our regiment's attack had begun. That morning they had made a last attempt to break through, only to suffer more casualties. On that day, efforts from outside had already ceased. They surrendered in the late afternoon at the request of our regimental commander and our battalion, who had led the fighting around the hilltop. Their losses were terrible. Of the original 5 companies, only about 450 went into captivity, most of them casualties. They left their positions toward our rear echelon, so that much to our regret, we had no opportunity to have a look at our gallant opponents. I am sure, though, that our comrades behind the hill were forming something of a guard of honor watching the captured Americans passing through their lines. Their officers, some 25 of them, were received with all honors at our regimental headquarters. Rumor had it that all of the men were handed a box of Coca-Cola each, a fine gesture by our commander, although I heard some grumbling that there weren't any boxes left for us. At daylight we had a closer look at each other. We couldn't help laughing at the 5-day-old beards on our pale, emaciated faces. For me, it was a mild shock to see my comrades' utter exhaustion. How long, I asked myself, could this go on? To return, we took the shortcut over the hilltop. We walked across the centre of the stage and saw the bodies still lying about in the devastated woodland, most of them separately, some already laid in rows by their comrades. They made peculiar bundles, easily recognised even under the snow. Battalion headquarters was just around the last bend on the road north. We passed our mule station, set up in a small stand of spruce. As we trudged by, the mule skinners watched us as if we had just risen from the dead. In the rear, they said our own casualties were lower than the enemy's, but they were still heavy. Much to my relief, I found Heinrich safe and sound. His number 2 gunner had fallen, though, shot in the neck when they brought an American attack to a stop 30 meters from their holes, the bullet ripping up the gunner's carotid artery and killing him instantly. One of his South Tyroleans had also been killed. Moreover, I learned that another platoon leader of the 12th Company had also been killed. Later in the day, I had our medic take a look at my feet. He said I had 2 frostbitten toes. I was lucky. The regiment had pushed the door wide open. The Americans were in retreat. The very next day, we began our pursuit south, which meant stalking in skirmish lines through the hilly woodland and mopping up the area. For us, it was quite a new experience. The region had not been evacuated, and we were bringing the war back to the people living there in their bleak settlements. They closed their window shutters at our approach, their faces speaking volumes. Certainly we weren't welcome here. In a small hamlet on our way, we met some resistance from American troops, but it was quickly broken. We found their remnants, signs of abundance as it seemed to us, cigarettes and candies. It was then that my squad picked up an American heavy machine gun, complete with tripod, cart and ammunition. We reckoned that sooner or later the enemy would start a massive counterattack, and that we would need all the firepower we could get, so we took the extra equipment. Stricker was promoted to this gun's number 2 gunner. We reached the village at the foot of the hillside by nightfall. Our advance platoon discovered that the armies hadn't yet withdrawn. At least they had left a rear party there. It was a short fight. Bypassing the village lying in a deep valley, we blocked their withdrawal, seized the place, and picked up the rear party together with their equipment. There were short bursts of submachine guns from our men swarming in from all sides. Vehicles with roaring engines stopped in their wild flight. No casualties on either side were reported. Loot was seized, PX goods and lots of oranges luxuries we hadn't enjoyed for years. All that greatly contributed to our rising spirits. Mopping up the village took us another hour or so, then all was quiet again. The American main force showed no inclination to come to their comrades' help, although they couldn't have failed to notice what had happened. We moved our gun into an emplacement south of the village, right beside our anti-tank gunners. Bing was at the gun. I noticed he had become taciturn. I knew he was Alsatian, and that somewhere on the plain extending in front of us was his home. You must feel funny coming home under these circumstances. Where is your hometown anyway? I asked. About 25 kilometers from here, half the distance to Strasbourg. It's a small village, he replied quietly. I tried to cheer him up. Just the right distance for a bicycle ride on a Sunday afternoon. He remained silent. Maybe, on a clear day, you could see it from these hills? I prompted. Yeah, I guess so, he said curtly. I saw I had missed the right tone, and I felt my own ignorance about Alsace. I knew it was borderland, taken from us under the Versailles Treaty, and in dispute between France and Germany for hundreds of years. I tried again. It's still French territory, Alsace, isn't it? That's correct. Is your family entirely German or Franco-Allemande? I asked. We're German, all right. My mother tongue is German, he confirmed. But you speak French fluently, don't you? Bing responded exasperatedly. You know I do. I remembered him singing a French song in our bunker east of Kirstinki, with Baumler accompanying him on his harmonica, something he only descended to on our firm request and when he was drunk. To put an end to my service, I departed for Lonquen, for the beautiful country, my ladies. What a paradise of little women. They are beautiful and faithful, and I became the husband of a little woman of the land called Matlauli. I'm the husband of a little woman. She is an Annamite. She is vital. She is charming. I had always wondered where he had picked up that song. It was a serviceman's song, after all. After a pause, he continued, At any rate, I didn't join the Waffen-SS to prove I'm a German, if that is what you mean. No, not at all, don't get me wrong, I protested. It's just that I'm trying to put myself in your position, fighting to win back your homeland, which actually has remained foreign. Foreign or not foreign, I don't think borderlines are that important. I once thought it was about Europe against Bolshevism. Then it went all wrong. Now I find myself in a kind of civil war. It's more and more confusing and drives me crazy, he confessed, frustrated. Surprised, I blurted, Now come on, civil war. We're fighting the Americans, aren't we? From my view, it's not that much different. Besides, do you know who our opponents are down at Colmar? He asked expectantly. N0, I don't, I confessed. I learned it only recently. French troops under the command of General Leclerc. So what? I said, still mystified. They aren't more than une quantité négligible. Nothing to be afraid of. He didn't reply for a while. When I glanced at him, he was looking over the sight of his gun, his chin resting on the butt, a faraway look in his eyes. I thought you knew, he said eventually. If they got me alive, I would be shot right away for defection. The issue was never pressed. Bing was killed 2 months later. He was only one of the European volunteers, the ones who set out to fight Bolshevism, and in the end became victims of their idealism, either on the battlefield or in the chauvinistic pitfalls of inter-European borders. I cannot believe that their idealism is dead, their vision of some greater zone where the common interest will prevail, and where borders, as Bing said, are not that important anymore. In the morning, when our gun was relieved, we went down the village street, freezing, worn out, dog-tired and hungry. We haven't quite gotten over Reipertsweiler. How long had it been since we had had a solid place to sleep in? Now we were promised one, the village church. The weather was clear and frosty. On our way, we went by the kitchen that had somehow managed to follow us overnight. We had coffee, genuine coffee, biscuits and oranges, all of it part of the loot. The church stood on a small rise. A flight of steps led to the door. Coming nearer, we saw American prisoners assembled in front. An officer and a sergeant were discussing what to do with them. As our regiment was in full motion, they couldn't be sent to the rear. Neither could they be left out in the cold on the village green after they had been there all night. Actually, the church was reserved for us. A solution of brilliant simplicity was found. Both the prisoners and ourselves were to share the room on the floor. We went inside, and once we settled down, it happened that the prisoners lay down right between us, so that Jaeger and Americans alternately would sleep next to each other on the wooden boards. By now, face to face with my first American prisoners, I was wide awake. The one to the left was white and pale, the one to the right slender and of brownish complexion. I asked them questions I now find naive. Why on earth had they come over to this continent to fight us? Shouldn't we instead have joined our forces and fight the Russians? Wasn't it in our common interest to keep Bolshevism out? They were very shy and didn't have much to say. My English was terrible, out of practice as I was, but I also had my first awareness that English and American are two different languages. Bing asked me politely to shut up. Soon all of us were sound asleep, at least all of us Jaeger. One guard stood by the door, and the sun shone peacefully through the stained glass windows. During the last days of February 1945, we pulled out of the sector in the Low Vosges. Our front there had served to block further attempts by the Americans to restore the territory they lost close to the German border. Operation Nordwind had been called off because the German forces, which had attacked into eastern Lorraine and northern Alsace from the north and east on New Year's Eve, had proved too weak to exploit their initial successes. In the end, the operation had failed to accomplish its principal mission objective, to win back Alsace and its capital Strasbourg, and to divide the French from the American armies. Faced with stiff resistance in this sector and preparing for their grand spring offensive, the Americans nevertheless sought to inflict as many casualties as they could, without sustaining many of their own during this static interlude. After their retreat from Reipertsweiler, the front lines had remained at a respectful distance from one another. Reconnaissance patrols operated on both sides, activities in which our patrol, consisting of Heinrich, a few others, and me, were rather successful, given the number of prisoners we took. Heinrich earned the Iron Cross for it, along with 1 week's leave. Our command knew from the prisoners that the Americans, for the time being, had no intention of resuming the offensive they had halted in mid-December. Instead, they turned on us with their artillery, intensifying their shelling week by week. Time and again we would hear of heavy casualties, especially in our rear echelon. Sometimes whole squads were wiped out when a bunker was hit by some large-caliber shell, and we would realize with bitter frustration that our own artillery, mainly because of the Allied air supremacy, was unable to strike back effectively. We ground away at our patrol activity with no major operation in sight, our fighting spirit flagging. It was high time for us to pull out. When we turned over our positions to the unit moving in and spent some days assembling in the rear, it was inevitable that we were confronted with the grim reality of the general war situation. Back from the woods and moving along the roads in the open, we instantly saw that Fortress Germany, as it was called in OF propaganda, was a bastion without a roof, open and exposed to Allied bombers. In daylight, except in bad weather, we lay low lest the American fighter planes fall upon us like hornets. Troop movement had become practically impossible in daylight. One day we heard on the radio that something terrible had happened at Dresden, of some terror strike of a level and cruelty unknown until then. No details were given. Worse yet, the Red Army had entered the Reich and was already west of the Oder. Here on the Western Front, but further north, the US Army already held 2 bridgeheads on the east bank of the Saar and was pushing towards Saarburg. This stage of the war, increasing in ferocity, appeared all the more frightening as apparently there was nothing we could do about it. In hindsight, one could say that it had been obvious all along how things were bound to go. Until then, though, the general thinking among us had been that our high command was capable of organizing an effective and lasting defense line along the borders of the Reich, and that some way to end the war could be worked out. Even if it came to the worst, our leadership would know best when to give up to avoid total disaster and the needless sacrifice of human lives. As we listened to the radio, however, we heard little more than the call on the German people to persevere, and the invocations of Providence for that matter. Oddly enough, we weren't deaf to those appeals, Wasn't this the time for the Waffen-SS to show its unwavering loyalty? Yet at the same time, there was a growing sentiment of doom and an end to hope. It was also at that time that I learned about Christina's death. The letter I had written to her from Denmark came back unopened together with a letter from a friend of hers. Christina had been killed in an air raid while on duty at her hospital in Hanover early in January. So, in the gloomy atmosphere of those days, this news came as another blow, a personal one, but all the same fitting into the general pattern. It hurt. The pain with all the other pains went deep into my heart. Heinrich helped me to get over that dark hour. When I had put back the letter into the envelope, I had seen his questioning glance and told him. A while after I had left the shack to be by myself, he had followed me and appeared by my side. "I know how you feel," he said. "I know it hurts. But believe me, it'll pass. You know, I'm wondering what in the end will be left that is worth the sacrifices," I said, leaving out my more personal feelings. I mean, this war isn't for its own sake. It's for keeping something dear to us, people we love, some part of our own life. Am I right? But if all these things are going to be ruined, what is all the suffering for? "Yes, I understand," he said sympathetically. "Don't worry, it's only a weak moment. 3 weeks ago I had my own dark hour when I got my week's leave and had no place to go because Königsberg was under siege. And there've been other dark moments before, can assure you. I still haven't any idea of my parents' whereabouts. But we can't afford that kind of worrying. It won't make you feel better anyway." "How can one stop thinking what it is all for?" I protested. "By facing the truth that things do happen to us, all sorts of things and all the time, and that there's little we can do about it." He continued, musing. "You see, in general, there isn't too much you can do about the course of your life. Most things just happen to you. Having volunteered for our unit was just an exception. But the next moment you were part of the system, no more choices. So you have to put up with things as they happen and play your role, play it as well as you can. No use worrying about what you can't change. But you can't stop thinking. I didn't say you should. On the contrary, you must think to draw conclusions. If you can't change the course of events, you've got to take it. I don't think I can live with that." "Oh yes, you can. I don't know if I want to. It'll make you stronger. Once you come to that conclusion, your mind will be free for more important things than worrying." "Such as?" "Your duty. Point is, I can't help thinking about what our duty is in this state of the war. Well, call it loyalty if you have to call it something. Have we fought in Lapland, at the Volga and in Africa to throw away our arms the moment the enemy enters the Reich?" He had spoken in a low and composed voice. What he said was another invitation to his world of stoicism in which I knew he felt at home. Besides, he was right. Hadn't we sworn to be the most faithful of the faithful? This moment was his hour. There was an air of serenity about him. Hope was no longer needed to outweigh the fear of loss. A few nights later, we left for a new sector to the north and west. It turned out only later that the division, acting on special orders from the Führer's headquarters, was to launch an attack across the Ruhr River, south of Trier. At first, our transport by truck appeared to be an aimless drive about the region, rather than part of a planned operation. Driving by night and resting during the day in obscure places, we, the plain soldiers, lost all orientation. We went along winding roads through wooded hill country, sometimes passing through vineyards on steep slopes high above deep river valleys, the Moselle or the Saar, perhaps. We didn't know. Somehow the journey seemed to be a blunder. The forlorn villages in the hills, still inhabited, seemed to turn their backs on the troops rushing through the night, as if seeking cover against the war closing in. At last our tour ended in a little town called Hermeskeil. From there we marched west. The attack was set for 4 a.m. on the 7th of March. We prepared as if going on a raid. We didn't take all our MGs with us and left all our heavy equipment behind. Heinrich's gun and my own were combined in one squad, Heinrich acting as gunner. Waiting for our departure time, we stood around in silence and tried to keep warm. For several days, the temperature had dropped below freezing again. A thin cover of snow was spread over the country. The night was pitch dark. You couldn't see the man next to you except for the glow of his cigarette. Suddenly there was a stir. An officer passed nearby, some words in a soft, deep voice to the men he brushed with his greatcoat. There was the faint gleam of a knight's cross. The battalion was on a last tour of inspection before we moved. It was good to know that he would be with us behind the American lines. For that was where we were going to operate, in the rear of the enemy's front line, south of the city of Trier. We started in single file, clambered quickly over a footbridge our engineers had built, and then set off cross-country. I had no idea where our position was to be, nor how we were to get there. Someone somewhere ahead was supposed to know. To not get lost in the total darkness, each one in the line was tied to the man in front of him by a rope. First, the path ran parallel to the valley, and then upwards toward our main objective, a road which ran along the ridge of the hills from north to south, a main supply route for the US Army. We walked for about 1.5 hours, with many interruptions for orientation. About halfway up, we walked parallel to the ridge. Then we halted. So far we had remained undetected. The night was still. Our platoon leader appeared, groping his way along our line, and ordered us to dig in on the forward slope that fell gently down to a village. However, in our jet-black surroundings, it was impossible to make out a proper spot for our machine gun to be emplaced. We just knew that we were standing in a bare field and that the ground was frozen. "Listen," I said. "This must be a mistake. You don't really expect us to emplace our MG on this ground? What are we supposed to do here anyway?" "Secure our men up on the road against the village down there," the platoon leader said. "By the way, the armies have some tanks in there." "What do you mean? You think we'll fight the tanks with my MG?" "Don't blame me. The order is clear. We have to hold this ground until further orders. About the tanks, don't worry. The battalion has positioned an anti-tank platoon by the exit of the village. They'll take care of them with their Offenrohre. There won't be more than 2 or 3 anyway. But we can't even dig in. This field is frozen hard as rock. We've still got far more than an hour before dawn. That should be enough. If you can't dig, tell your men to scratch themselves into the ground, no matter how, and for heaven's sake don't make any noise." "Why the hell don't we attack as long as it's dark and the tanks aren't out in the open?" I demanded to know, but he had already vanished into the blackness. I was desperate. "This is going to be a fiasco," Heinrich said, scratching the surface of the ground with his spade. "It's pointless to establish an emplacement here. We should try to get out of here as soon as possible." I told him what the platoon leader had said. "Oh shit! What goddamn shit!" was all he said, and carried on working the ground. I went around looking after the others of our squad. All of us feverishly worked with our spades, heedless of the noise, and managed to excavate flat hollows for cover. Heinrich and I even made a small embrasure, but still had no more than a sham of a machine gun emplacement. In between, I lost my submachine gun. Working the ground, I had laid it aside and then was unable to find it again in the pitch dark. So, in expectation of the enemy, I found myself crouching on all fours and groping for my weapon, cursing and feeling panic rise, until I finally touched the treasured piece of metal. Down in the village there was a constant noise of what must have been the idling engines of the American tanks. Dawn came an hour later. Suddenly behind us, some 2 kilometers up on the hill, there were submachine gun bursts, explosions, more small arms fire. Obviously, the battalion had its first contact with the enemy on the road. Then, at various other places, automatic weapons fire flared up, first on the right, then the left. Our artillery sent over their first rounds for support. In no time, a battle was underway behind the American lines. On our slope and down in the village, nothing moved. All of us felt the rising tension. For a moment, we cherished the hope we would still be ordered to attack the village before it was too late. We were prepared for any desperate action if only we could get off this field. This hope was not fulfilled, however. For now, down in the village, we could hear the roar of the tank's engines being revved up, one after another, each roar soon turning into a dark drone. There were more than 2 or 3 of them, perhaps many more. We could hear them moving about and preparing for action. All our hope now rested on the engineers and their Offenrohr. Then, in the grey light of the early morning, the Shermans slowly appeared from the near edge of our rounded slope. Our anti-tank weapons, on which all our hopes rested, remained silent. What had gone wrong down there? Were they employed elsewhere? Slowly, the tanks rolled upward, 2, 3, then more, 6 or 7, I forget. First, we saw the lead tank with its turret open, and the machine gunner opening fire on our foxholes from further down the field. The tank was still too far away from us to open fire. Then we saw American infantry in a skirmish line, cautiously taking cover behind the metal giants. Our men further down the slope had offered no resistance, or were there any? What could be done anyway without anti-tank weapons? While the lead tank was slowly going on and the gunner kept firing away, Heinrich had him in his sight. We couldn't take that any longer. In an act of despair, we opened fire, a couple of bursts only, no tracers. Immediately the gunner disappeared, the lid slammed down, the machine gun pivoting awkwardly on top. The tank stopped, went on and stopped again, and so did the others. Their infantry hit the dirt. Moving forward in a somewhat oblique direction, the tank's crew now had discovered our conspicuous position. The vehicle jerked around on its tracks and came directly toward us, while the others moved on, deploying in a dispersed formation. With turrets closed, the tank crews began their deadly work of eliminating each of the foxholes scattered over the field, slowly and without mercy. The lead tank rolled ahead another length toward our emplacement, stopped and aimed its big gun at us. Faced with the black hole of the gun's muzzle, we had just enough time, a fraction of a second, to press ourselves with all our might down into our hollow. Then the first shot was fired. It missed entirely. From that moment, though, we were silenced all the same. Just the incredible noise and concussion of the shot at such close range is something no man can take. Waiting for the second shot, head pressed to the ground, I was eye to eye with Heinrich. His complexion had turned pale white. His eyes were wide open and full of terror, just the way I must have looked to him. The second shot hit the ground right behind us, but did no harm either. A short pause. We remained tightly flattened on the bottom of our insufficient cover, completely still. The other tanks passed by and worked their way up the hill. Bing was hit, and we heard his terrible wail, "My leg! My leg!" Then the third shell went off, again meant as a direct hit. It was another miss. It was unbelievable. Were they playing cat and mouse with us? Was it a prolonged execution, a kind of torture? Whatever, we didn't expect to get out of there alive. Next time they wouldn't miss. Then the Sherman's crew had another try. There was another terrible blast, lifting the ground and making our bodies jump. But this time the shot came too short, exploding directly before our embrace, hurling our machine gun up in the air and throwing up the din of the embrace down on us. It was the last shot. All the time I had been fully conscious of what was happening. The firing came to an end. We heard the excited voices of the infantrymen closing in from behind the Sherman. I realized it was over. Miraculously, we had survived and remained unhurt, thanks to the fidgety nerves of an American tank gunner. Slowly, with our hands up, we rose from our hollow. The infantrymen approached, slowly and nervously, constantly aiming their rifles at us. I heard Bing moaning from his hole behind me and looked back. He lay there, still seeking cover, one leg strangely twisted and bleeding profusely. "Get up, Bing!" I shouted. "It's over!" But instead of putting up his hands first, he grabbed his rifle with both hands, probably to prop himself up. It was a terrible mistake. The same moment, one of the GIs hurled a hand grenade over into his hole. We hit the dirt, and the explosion followed instantly. I was deeply shocked and still on my knees when someone jerked at my helmet, choking me violently with my chin strap until it came off. It was my first and painful lesson as a prisoner who is not supposed to wear a helmet. Standing upright again, we were quickly searched for weapons. We looked around, and what we saw was the saddest sight we ever faced. Wherever we looked, none of our men remaining on the field was alive. Bing's body was torn apart. Stricker was dead, and so was one of our replacements. In the foxholes farther away, the men were lying motionless in the awkward positions of the dead. For a while we kept staring at the ghastly scene, before one of the infantrymen was ordered to take the two of us away. Our artillery had begun firing into the village. From a distance, especially up on the road, we heard the battle raging on, as it would do for the next 2 days. For us, it already was a distant affair. Stupefied, we tried to comprehend what had happened. Then they took us down the slope to the village. When we entered the village, I saw that. Its name was Lamparden. It is October again. 1 year has passed since I began to write my account of the volunteers under the Black Edelweiss. I believe that my narrative of their victories and their defeats, of their small joys and of their suffering, of their idealism and of their self-sacrifice, are a true picture of that brief span of their lives which is today the object of damnation and disdain. Now that my narration is finished, I feel a great relief, as if at last I have done my duty. Coincidentally, early this month, after a 10-month trial, the International Military Tribunal has pronounced its verdict and found the Waffen-SS, as part of the Allgemeine SS, guilty of being a criminal organization. So they've done it. So under the law of the victors, the volunteers were a gang of criminals, and their dead have died in disgrace. Even those who were in combat all the time are still held responsible for crimes that happened elsewhere behind the lines, crimes that many survivors of their combat tours find difficult to accept as fact even today. The court, however, has stated that the knowledge of the crimes was general, that the criminal program of the organization was so widely known and implied a slaughter of such a colossal extent that their criminal activities must have been widely known by those who volunteered. Such is the construct of their culpability in the findings of the International Military Tribunal. The verdict is meant to rob us of our honor, the very last value of which a defeated enemy can be deprived. Ehre verloren, Afes verloren. Honor lost, all lost. Unconditional surrender was not enough. Humiliation had to be added to make their victory complete. In my life as a prisoner, I am still working with Captain Herbert, and I see him daily. He hasn't commented on the tribunal's verdict up to now. I can feel his sympathy, and I'm grateful for it, but I have no desire to reopen our former discussion, a discussion of no avail except for having someone listen to one's lament. I can't expect him to dispute the tribunal's judgment. For him it must be Roma tocuta, causa genita. Rome has spoken, the case is closed. Moreover, there are, even without the captain's help, my own, if quite different, doubts that warn me against all self-righteousness. Since those mass killings and other crimes against humanity seem to be true, and since they were organized by criminals wearing our uniform, who is to be blamed first, the organization or the court? Is it then any wonder that the silver runes are now regarded as a symbol of all wickedness? And who can be surprised that this symbol's power proved to be the overriding force, and that an acquittal, if only for the combat troops, simply could not happen? Wasn't there a great betrayal in the first place, committed by the little man with his thick, round spectacles, who used to masquerade in field grey, but couldn't hope ever to enjoy the respect of the combat troops? Isn't it evident by now that part of his scheme was to associate the soldiers with the vile bequest of his racial fanaticism? Was ist aus uns geworden? What has become of us? Have we been poisoned by the racial fanaticism of our leadership and become an active instrument of the monstrous regime? Judging by what I read in the new German papers, the public response to the verdict is approval, if not satisfaction. And what has become of our people in general? Listening to my fellow prisoners talk, it seems that only their own individual concerns and future matter. There is at best the indifference that results from a general weariness with all the horrible revelations during months of the trial. Defeating Bolshevism, defending the fatherland and the Reich. These objects of innumerable sacrifices seem to be of no interest anymore. Was all of that only a creation of propaganda without real bearing for the common people? Even in terms of territory, I don't know what has become of us. East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania and the Sudeten are provinces lost, after our fellow countrymen have been expelled from their soil, apparently forever. They are no longer even considered part of Germany. From there to the west, the Soviet reign extends far into the heartland of our country, all the way to the Harz Mountains, the homeland of the first emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, including Blenheim and much of the land of Brunswick. Is this occupation another dismemberment in the long run? What actually did the Reich mean? Was it just an episode in Germany's history, as a German paper editorialized the other day? What is left after the fall of the Reich upon which to build our common future? In the course of this war, Germany had subjected many old countries to her rule, and let most of them retain their territorial identities. Is there a country left that can still be called Germany? I do not know. Our world has perished. A new world dawns, one in which our values are utterly discredited, and we will be met with hatred or distinct reserve for our past. Come on, I say, it's not without reason, let's face it. What counts is our future and what we are going to do with it. That is the territory where we will have to prove what we were really like, the territory of another probation. I only hope we will not be denied that opportunity. Yet there can be no release from our loyalty to our dead, from our duty to stand up for them, and to ensure that their remembrance and their honour will remain untarnished. They, like all the others fallen in the war, or murdered through racial fanaticism, must be remembered as a solemn warning never to let it all happen again. There is more in it that must be clarified and maintained, however. The cause for which they died may have been corrupt, and the symbols under which they fought may have been vile, but their profound selflessness, their loyalty to their country, and their final sacrifice possess a value of their own. It is the spirit of youth without which a nation cannot live.